In this lesson, we'll learn how to draw breasts at different angles and under different circumstances. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so in the previous lesson, we focused on drawing some accurate, more natural-looking breasts looking straight on our female subject here. Now we're going to kind of explore how to draw breasts at a couple of different angles as well as under some different circumstances. So we're going to go ahead and zoom over here, and we got some different poses that we're basically going to be working with. And so as I mentioned in the previous lesson, breasts aren't perfectly round. They're not perfect circles. In fact, to recap, we can show that bad example of these gravity-defying orb-shaped breasts that just look entirely incorrect and unnatural on our subject here. And so we want to continue to avoid stuff like that, even drawing them at a different angle. So we'll go ahead and hide that. And we'll focus on our female over here on the far screen left. And we're going to draw her breasts at a 3/4 view, which will very much fit her pose that we have here. So again, breasts are very much teardrop shaped. They're not perfect circles where they come out like that. They don't come out like that. That just looks entirely unnatural. So we want to avoid that. So rather instead, they're going to start to kind of come down, slope down like this. And then gradually you'll kind of start to see it round off a little bit, and then you got this really quick drop off right here. So this area right here where it starts to kind of, where there's kind of a recess, think of that area as very much the same as this area right there. All right. Now how much mass you want to include in that, that's entirely up to you, but there is some truth into going too large to where it just looks entirely unbecoming and unfitting for the form that you're dealing with. So definitely keep that in mind. So again, it kind of starts out where it's kind of teardrop shaped like this. Then it'll kind of start to round off a little bit right where we come to the kind of the apex or the curve of the breast right there. And then we have just this really major kind of drop off right there. And so this really illustrates gravity taking effect on this part of the body where you just basically got a lot of fat right there that's being pulled down by gravity. And so we could basically come over here and illustrate the same thing. And so kind of coming off this armpit curve right here, I can kind of start to work in the same overall shape. I'm imagining that teardrop shape for the breasts. So we'd get something kind of like that. Again, I'm not inserting any kind of cleavage lines or anything like that because there's no external force pushing them together or pushing them upward. And we'll show an example of that on our next pose right next to this one. Okay, so these are much more natural looking. In fact, if we wanted to just go ahead and show what these would look like incorrectly, this is probably what they would look like incorrectly. And so you don't want that. You don't want something that looks like that. These are those are basically lines, again, that are not being affected by gravity. They look unnatural. They don't feel like they fit the rest of the form. Okay, so now we want to also insert the nipples on these breasts too. And on our layer here called Nipple Guide, which we used in the previous lesson to establish the placement of the nipples on our front-facing breasts, just going ahead and turn that on, we can incorporate that over here as well. So starting at that if you can imagine this T, that same T being incorporated over here, this is where the intersection point would be of that T. As I mentioned earlier, that intersection point of our T is basically an area where you kind of have that recess. So we've got like our collarbones and stuff, and then there's like that recess. And you can feel this on your own body just by reaching up. You can kind of feel that little recess area. And so that's basically what you want to look for. And then just coming off of that, just like we did with our example over here on the front-facing breasts, we can come out at an approximate 45-degree angle. So in doing so, that kind of allows us to figure out where we want to place our lines for our nipple. So something like that. And then probably right about there too. And so we can kind of start to see how those kind of line up. Make that line a little cleaner so we can kind of see that. Okay, and so again, breasts don't point perfectly straight outward, straight ahead. They kind of come out on an angle. And so think about that when you're incorporating your lines here for your placement of the nipples. And the placement of the nipples is just going to help further illustrate that they're not pointing straight outward, but rather coming out kind of on a slight angle rather than coming out straight ahead like that. Okay, so now let's talk about what these breasts would look like if there was an external force such as like a push-up bra affecting them. So we can kind of come over here, and this is an example where we'll start to have a lot more of that mass being included on the upper part of the breast. We're not going to have a very evident teardrop shape any longer. Okay, so we would probably get something that feels actually a lot more like this. And they're going to be basically pushed up a lot higher. So there's going to be, now there will be a lot more fullness to them. And I'm just kind of coming around, roughing this in. We can kind of just go ahead and draw like what it would look like if there was a bra on these breasts. And so now we're kind of changing the overall shape of them due to an external force being applied to them. I'm just kind of working in some straps here just to kind of further illustrate what this bra would look like and how it would affect the shape of these breasts. So they're basically being pushed upward like this, and they're also being pushed together. And so you're going to get, that's when you're free to kind of draw in these kinds of lines. So if you've got, that's where you would actually have some cleavage placed in. So they're being pushed upward, and then they're being pushed together. All right, so in a situation like that, you could kind of probably get away with something more like that. But still keep in mind the placement of where those nipples would be. This doesn't mean that they're pointing straight outward. Breasts are still, they still kind of point out on an angle, kind of like that. All right. Now, what happens if she holds her arms upward? We're going to go ahead and hide that nipple guide really quick. And so, what happens to the breasts? How do they change in shape and appearance if her arms are kind of going upward? I mean, it's going to be pulling up on that part of the body, that flesh right there, that fat that basically makes up the breast is going to be affected because the skin is pulling on all that, pulling it all upward. So, what's going to result is you're going to have some shapes that are a lot more elongated. You're still going to kind of have that teardrop shape, but there's not going to be as much overlap coming outward, all right? Because it's all being kind of stretched, basically. So we'd kind of have some shapes that look kind of similar to this. Something that feels just a lot more elongated. And we kind of bring this line, again, kind of coming up into that armpit area. So you definitely want to keep in mind the situation at hand. What is your subject doing? How is that going to affect, in this case, these breasts? So a bad example, coming back to illustrating bad examples, if you had a female that was doing some sort of action pose or had her arms up doing something, if she's hanging from something, you wouldn't want her breasts to, look like this. It just wouldn't make sense. It doesn't look natural. And there's not going to be any kind of cleavage or anything like that happening right there in the center because they're not being forced together. They're just being pulled upwards and being stretched out. And so again, coming back to that nipple guide, you can still use that if you can imagine, again, that recess point right there between the collarbone. And then just coming off of that, we can, again, accurately place where those nipples are supposed to go. And that, again, helps kind of add to the illusion of the direction in which they're pointing. They're not pointing straight towards us. So if we can kind of imagine an arrow pointing towards us, they're not coming towards us. they kind of point outward at an angle. So in this example, basically gravity is still affecting these breasts, but they're just being stretched out, kind of being pulled by these arms, kind of pulling all the skin upward. All right. And let's go ahead and explore what breasts would look like at just a side view. Again, we want that teardrop shape to be very apparent. So again, we don't want to have a giant bulging line like that. Again, doesn't look natural. We want to have a gradual sloping in, and then we have a quicker drop off. So something kind of like that. So my best advice is for drawing things like this on the female body is definitely look at a lot of reference. You know, if you've got a figure drawing class you're able to go to, breasts come in all different sizes, so they're all going to be affected a little bit differently. This isn't the be-all, end-all way to draw breasts, but it's a pretty good guide, I think, to follow just getting started out. But again, if you have access to a figure drawing class where you can study how breasts look at different shapes and sizes and how they're being affected by different poses, different external forces, whether it's some sort of garment or bra, definitely study those. And that's going to allow you to really draw them more accurately on the different poses that you may draw your subject in. Okay, so in the next lesson, we're going to focus on one more attribute of the female body, and we're going to kind of focus on the back side of our subject here, kind of explore what does it look like, how should she look like at a side view, and how the back should arc, and how the placement of the hips should be. So we'll see you then.